thank you. And thank you for selecting my poster for an oral presentation today. First, I'm going to start with a little bit about why I decided to do this. So this presentation is a little different than most of what we've gotten on this. It's less taking measurements and running statistics and all of that. This was a survey that I did of American Muslims just to kind of gauge their attitudes on a few things. So it's a little bit different. And one of the reasons I started with my research in this area is because I'm looking for ways to break down the antagonism between the halal slaughter industry and the conventional slaughter industry, because I think, especially being at an international conference here, we're very well aware that that antagonism exists, and I'm looking for ways to break down that antagonism so that we can find meaningful ways to make changes. Part of the reason we're doing this is that halal is a rapidly growing market sector. As of 2010, so this is a little bit of older data, there were 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, most of those being in Southeast Asia and East Asia. One of the things that makes halal a little bit complicated is there are very complex standards worldwide. So we're looking at a very variable industry and trying to find common ground to make improvements in, which makes it a little more difficult, and I think it's one of the reasons work like this is very important, because I think it's important to get the consumer perspective on where they want those halal standards to go. Partially, the reason consumers are so important in halal is that Islam is not a hierarchical religion. It's the responsibility of each individual Muslim to have an individual relationship with their faith, and that means that there's not one person that you can go to and say, what should halal standards be, and that person will tell all Muslims what they should be. You really have to have Muslims be involved in this process if we're going to get a unified standard. And why I'm working in animal welfare is because animal welfare is actually part of the spirit of halal. I'm not saying, and Dr. Farouk said this earlier, it's not necessarily the case on the ground, but in spirit, animal welfare is very important. Earlier today, the 5 freedoms were mentioned, which originally came from the Bramble report that was written in 1965. And if you know anything about animal welfare, you know those freedoms. It's the freedom from hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, the freedom from pain, injury, and disease, the freedom to express natural behavior, and the freedom from fear and distress. Now, I want to contrast that for you with something that was written by an Islamic scholar. I don't know the exact date. He was born in 1181 and died 80 years later, so it was somewhere in that time that he wrote this. So I'm going to read you a quote, and I want you to just think about those 5 freedoms and think about what I'm going to tell you that was written approximately 800 years before the Bramble report. The rights of creatures and animals over mankind are the following: that he spend on them the provisions that their kinds require, even if they have aged or sickened, such that no benefit comes from them, that he not burden them beyond what they can bear, that he not put them together with anything by which they can be injured, whether of their own kind or other species, whether by breaking their bones or butting or wounding, that he slaughter them with kindness, that when he slaughters them, he neither flays their skin nor breaks their bones until their bodies have become cold and their lives have passed away, that he not slaughter their young within their sight, but he isolate them, that he make comfortable their resting places and watering places, that he put their males and females together during their mating seasons, that he not discard those which he takes as game, and neither shoot them with anything that breaks their bones, nor bring about their destruction by any means that renders them unlawful to eat. So 800 years before that Bramble report, this is what Islamic scholars were saying. And I think that's an important thing to remember in the current frame of antagonism that we have. My hypothesis working on this is that Muslims don't see themselves as having to choose between religion and animal welfare. So that being said, these are the questions I asked. The first 2 questions on that list were just to make sure I got the right population and that they were okay with me using their results. This survey was sent out to a large variety of different Muslim groups within the United States. It was sent out primarily via the internet. one of the reasons I did no statistics is because I have no idea how many people received this survey. I only know how many decided to take it. So the questions that we have in bold are the ones that I was primarily looking at. The others were a little bit to distract the people taking the surveys so that I didn't have them having the phenomenon of trying to pick the right answer. So the first question we'll look at, in the last 5 years, has your awareness of animal welfare changed? Your options are no, yes, I am less concerned than I was, yes, I am more concerned than I was, yes, I have changed what factors I'm concerned with. I'm not exactly sure what people were thinking when they picked that, but I wanted to give them an option that said, none of the rest fit me quite right, but yes, I care. There were 50 people that responded to this survey. I forgot to say that in the other one. So that 2% means one person is less concerned than they were about animal welfare 5 years ago. And those people that said no, we don't know if they're not concerned about animal welfare or they've just been concerned for more than 5 years. But I think it's important to look at trends and changing perspectives when you're trying to gauge consumer feelings. So you'll see here, the important thing to look at is that 61% of the population that I surveyed said that they care more about animal welfare than they did 5 years ago. So here's the second question that we have. In the last 5 years, has your awareness of your halal meat source changed? And again, we have those same options. And in this one, I think it's interesting to note that 48% are more concerned than they were 5 years ago. In this one, I think there's a higher possibility that the people who said no are going with what their family has gone with for generations, so they don't necessarily change their perspective very much. I think this for me was the most interesting comparison that I drew. So what I did in this question is or in this graph here, is that I took the people who had answered, yes, I am more concerned with my halal meat source than I was 5 years ago, and I looked at how they answered that question about animal welfare. So within that group, if you just take that subset, and like I said, this isn't a huge number of survey results, so I understand that breaking it up is a little bit tricky, but you'll see here that 71% of this population group cares more than they did 5 years ago about animal welfare and is more concerned about animal welfare. The reason there's only 2 responses listed here is because everyone in the group that answered yes to the question about halal meat fell in one of the 2 categories for the other one. So here, let's remember that if we think back to that other question, 61% of the general survey population cared more about animal welfare than they did 5 years ago, whereas people who were more concerned about their halal meat source, 71%. So you're actually looking, to me this says that if people care more about where their halal meat comes from, they're also more aware of animal welfare. Okay, I think this is going to surprise a lot of you. And like I said, this is not necessarily what's happening on the ground, but this is the perspective of the Muslim consumer. And I said, what do you believe about halal meat and animal welfare? And the options that they could pick were, I believe that halal slaughtered animals have better welfare. I believe that conventionally slaughtered animals have better welfare. I do not know how type of slaughter affects animal welfare. And here you'll see that only one person thinks that conventionally slaughtered animals have better welfare of these survey respondents, and 67% thinks that halal slaughtered animals have better animal welfare. I think this goes back to that quote that I had at the beginning, where a lot of Muslim consumers, when I talk to them, they believe that there's a different source of the animals coming into the system. They believe that we have more control over the chain of animals getting to the slaughter plant than we do, so I think a lot of their perception about animal welfare comes from their belief that those animals were treated better prior to the time that they got to the slaughter plant. So here's some conclusions from what I drew. It's pretty clear, I think, that Muslim consumers do support animal welfare. I think the halal industry needs to find better ways to meet this demand. And I very strongly believe that conflict between the conventional and the halal system of slaughter isn't serving the animals, it's not serving the consumers, and it's not serving the industry. I think we need to look for scientific ways to work together towards better animal welfare across the means of slaughter. I think if we're looking at questions that we can ask consumers, I think it would be really interesting to ask Muslim consumers if they'd be willing to pay more for an animal that they had a guarantee for better animal welfare. I also think, like I said, this survey was sent out to American Muslims, North American Muslims, and I think it would be interesting to see if the trends that I noticed correlate across the global Muslim community. And I think given that quote that I read at the beginning, I think it's actually possible for the halal industry to start leading the way in some of these welfare issues, because we already have a consumer base that's dedicated to a certification system, which I think is a little bit different than what most people see. They see the halal industry as trying to put on the brakes on animal welfare, and I really think that we're in a position to be leaders in that arena. And then I also, the reason this last question is important, what are consumers' primary animal welfare concerns? It's not because I think consumers should drive the animal welfare concerns and the changes that we make. I think it's important that we know what they're concerned about, because once we know what they're concerned about, we either need to make changes in the industry, or we need to do a better job of educating our consumers about science so that we change what they feel like they need so that they can accept what's best for the animals. And here's just some references and some thanks. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.